Welcome to 100 Stories, the Narrative Intelligence Project. I'm your host, Paige Williams. Ride along with me as I build the emerging field of narrative intelligence by learning from 100 thinkers, creators, researchers, leaders, healers, peoples whose lives have been shaped by profound change. Together, we are exploring a question at the center of how we become who we are. And that question is, how malleable are the stories we live by? What does it take to change one? Across these conversations, we will examine the stories we inherit, the stories that become identity, and the human capacities that allow us to recognize, question, revise, and live beyond them. What I learned through this series will help shape the field of narrative intelligence and the foundational book that I'm writing about it. This is 100 Stories. Today I'm speaking with Thaler Pekar, whose work centers around helping smart leaders say what needs to be said, hear what needs to be heard, and build cultures of excellent communication. I invited Thaler to 100 Stories because I have so much to learn from her 3 decades of vast experience around communication and story. Welcome, Thaler. So glad to have you here.
Paige, I'm very happy to be here.
We will dive right in, and I'm going to start with, tell me about the work and experiences that have most shaped how you understand story, leadership, and human behavior.
I've worked in communication for many, many years. And at the start of this century, there is a huge focus on telling people to talk about their values. I was doing public affairs work mainly with progressive organizations. And it was, if you believe in community, talk about community. If you believe in education, talk about education. And it became very aware that community means something completely different to a farmer in Montana than perhaps it means to a gay oboe player on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And so the only way to make it clear what you meant and to invite people to really understand and unpack these values and invite people to see themselves in them was through story. And I was working with progressive clients who weren't necessarily getting ahead as quickly as I wanted them to. My brother is the manager of the Brain Imaging Institute at the Kennedy Kirby Center at Johns Hopkins. And I started talking to him about how people hear and process information. And that really led me down the path of story. And so I did a real deep dive into story, into the neuroscience behind it, into how we hear and process information. I started writing about it a lot, and I think the time was right for somebody who didn't have a woo-woo take on it, but was talking about it as a very powerful communication tool. That was one way in. The other thing that it was a real pivotal moment was, again, working in this public affairs firm. I was introduced to a client once by my vice president who said, "Oh, and this is Thaler. She knows how to get feature stories for our clients." And I thought, isn't that what we all do here? And I realized it wasn't, that other people were great at getting lots of reporters to show up for a press briefing. And I was terrible at that. But I was really good at going into an organization, spending a day with people, walking around, asking questions, listening, and I would find the small story that exemplified the big narrative of what the organization was doing, or the big narrative behind the advocacy that they were working on. And because of that, I got cover stories in the New York Times Magazine and in Time Magazine and in O Magazine and 7 Pages in People Magazine. And I was just able to find the stories that helped invite people into understanding.
How did it change the company who you were working with and serving in finding their stories and reporting on it?
We were really successful. I brought in a lot of business, and it was wonderful. I did another job while I was there. I ran a huge program on religious pluralism at the Ford Foundation. I did the communications aspect of that, which was fascinating and so interesting. I also worked with the United Nations Population Fund as a client, and I went all over the world helping advocates in different areas figure out an advocacy plan for whatever their goal, their issue was, and then how to communicate it. So my background was an intersection of communications and public affairs work and advocacy work. And being able to do that around the world was incredible. So I would spend 3 days over a 5-day period helping people develop these plans. What did they want accomplished? Who were the people who could make that happen? And how did you reach them? And then I would help them practice in the last 2 days on camera what they wanted, what they needed to say to be heard and help make that policy go forward. You had asked in an email about a story that was really pivotal in my work. And one of them was early in my life, in my late 20s, I started an advocacy group in Hoboken, New Jersey, where I live. And this is a mile square town on the banks of the Hudson River, directly across from New York City. And we would table. This was before the internet, and you would actually stand on the street corner on a weekend and get signatures and ask people to join the telephone list. And we became a very, very powerful organization. We could mobilize 500 people overnight. It was wonderful. It changed my career doing this work because that's when I professionalized the advocacy work. We would have letters that people could sign, and we would then send to legislators. And one day a woman came by the table and she said, "Oh my God, I heard from my congressman. I came and stopped at the table several weeks ago and I signed the letter and he wrote me back." And she had never participated in democracy that way. She didn't understand that she had a voice, her voice could be heard, it mattered, she would get answered back, and her absolute glee at being heard was something I hold with me to this day. And that completely changed me. I think I've always long believed that everybody deserves to be heard and deserves the spaciousness to hear other people as well. And we need to create that space. But I still remember that woman getting so excited and my being dumbfounded and then realizing this is pivotal and incredibly.
In the evolution of your work and shifting from not just communication, but storytelling, and the transformation that happens for people and for companies as a result of that storytelling, what are you most surprised by? Why do you lean in even deeper?
I'm surprised that people find it hard. We're telling stories all the time, and I want people to lean into their innate ability to do it. And I want people to recognize the gift that they're being given when somebody shares a story with them, that if they listen closely, they're hearing facts and values and emotions and things that couldn't be said any other way. I'm surprised that people don't realize that stories are being said whether or not they're listening to them. And I'm so happy and appreciative that's actually not as powerful a word as I would like to say of how thrilled I am about your work and your bringing up the idea of narrative intelligence and having more people appreciate that we tell stories, we hear stories, we are living within the context of multifaceted stories.
What story do you tell about one of the most defining or transformative moments of your own life? And has that story changed over time?
It is the story of the woman at the table. Another story that I'm realizing threads through my life is, again, I mentioned living in Hoboken and what this town means to me. In 1990, there was a referendum to stop the waterfront from being overdeveloped through corporate interests. And that referendum was won by the citizens by 12 votes. And so to vote in, to witness, to organize for, and participate in a referendum that has completely changed my city and has made it so beautiful and so much more civically engaged is a really big story. And it changes in the sense that I'm constantly finding my connection to it and realizing the power that it's had over me. I don't tell it differently, but the meaning of it's getting deeper and deeper. There's another story about a near-death experience I had. In maybe it was 24 years ago, I almost drowned in Costa Rica and I went under, I got caught in an undertow. I went under several times. I came up, I managed to scream for help. I happened to be on one of the few beaches in Costa Rica that had a lifeguard, thank goodness. I went down again, I came up again. I saw that there was a crowd on the beach, so I knew that people had heard me scream. I went down again. I was rescued. Luckily, I know people friends of a friend who actually died a year later on that same beach. That story, I was married about a year and a half when that happened. And I really felt, I was with my husband and I felt that he had my back. And 6 months after that happened was when I opened my own business. And I felt that he had my back and I could do that. I knew what it was like to ask for help. I hadn't done that before much in my life. And I think having that experience helped me start the business. And so that's a story that, again, I find different ways into over the years. It takes on, it shows itself to have different meaning to me.
Can we go a little deeper in having that near-death experience? Connect the dots for us between that feeling of desperation and having to cry out for help. 6 months later, saying, I'm going to start a business and needing help and asking for it. Connect those dots between the experience, the story you told yourself that developed from that experience, and then the action you took as a result of that experience.
I think what I'm trying to say is at the time, I did not connect the dots.
Right.
It was only years later that I realized I had a deep sense that my husband and I could take this risk of me going out. He's self-employed as well. So for me to walk away from a job with benefits, this is before the ACA. And so I think I realized we could do this. I saw myself survive this thing. You go through something like that, and once the water comes out of your sinuses and you get all this sand out of your hair and, that night you're out for dinner, like it didn't happen. And you move on. And yeah, I'll tell you, there was something else interesting that happened at that moment that I suppose is related to storytelling that I've never thought about before. I were thinking, this must be what it feels like to be drowning. And it was almost like a cartoon character in one ear saying that. And then this little character in the other ear said, you are drowning, Thaler. And so that was two stories I was sort of hearing in my head at the same time.
How do you make sense of that?
It's a brand new experience. So the first thing that happened was sort of gee, this must be what it feels like to be drowning. And thankfully I had a self-preservation. I mean, we all do. I had the self-preservation that kicked in that said, you are drowning and you need to do something. And then I remember saying to myself, just don't take water in. Whatever you do, do not take water in. And yeah, it all worked out.
Isn't it interesting that as humans, we can be going through a terrifying, like, near-death experience and think, well, this would be one of those situations that would be like that, instead of recognizing that, oh, this is the situation, and then maybe that pops in. But I think what's interesting about that is it says a lot about how we understand life through narrative. We don't actually necessarily are in the moment experiencing something, taking in that experience. We can understand our experience through a story we've heard, interpreted, and then maybe down the road we'll realize that, oh, we created our own story in that moment. But in the moment, like, we're not even connecting necessarily to this is the moment.
Someone smarter than me has said, we cannot make sense of things while they're happening. We only make sense of them afterwards. And that's what storytelling is, right? While the emotions are happening, while you're in the car crash, you're not understanding that you're not storifying it while you're in that situation. You create the story afterwards. And to your question of how does that story change, we change those stories afterwards. We make sense of them when we get new pieces of information and add on new pieces. I mean, I imagine if I were to have a religious awakening, I could then say, I was saved by powers that whatever powers I would believe in. I could add that onto the story, understand it in a completely new way going forward. Yeah, we can't make sense of things while they're happening. We make sense of them afterwards.
It's what makes us unique, right? As humans, our ability to tell story and make meaning out of what happened to us.
Yeah.
So 5 or 6 years later, if I'm following your timeline, you also decided to include narrative and storytelling into your work and went to your brother who teaches, or tell me more about brain science, and understand the importance of storytelling.
I had always been working with story. I just don't think I knew how good I was at it. I wasn't giving myself the credit for being able to find the small stories that told the big narratives. I knew I was great at doing advocacy work and helping people find a story that would push the issue forward, the person who exemplified the issue that we were working on. When I was state organizer for the National Abortion Rights Action League in New Jersey, we were working hard at that time to stop parental notification laws in New Jersey. And there was a story about a young woman named Becky Bell who had died from an illegal abortion because she didn't want to disappoint her parents, a straight A student, head of the cheerleading squad. And that was a story that was being used for those advocacy purposes. When I was coaching people on media appearances, I would help them find the story that would invite people in. So I was always innately good at it. I just didn't structure it and talk about it and hang out a shingle saying, I do story. I found through the knowledge management field, I found a lot of people who were working with story in organizations. Stephen Denning had written The Secret Language of Leadership, I believe is the title of the book. And he was putting on these Smithsonian conferences about organizational storytelling that I actually was the opening co-keynote at the last one that they held. So there was a field at that time or a sector called applied narrative. And there were all these people who were using story in business and advocacy and being much more intentional about it. And that was the applied narrative field at the start of the early mid 2000s.
When you think about your own story and how you were raised, do you think you came out telling stories? Did your parents teach you storytelling? Is it in your DNA? Is it learned? Is it both?
I think it's in all our DNA. No, I was not from a storytelling house. Storytelling was not a part of my household. Religion was. We were a very religious household. And I was lucky enough that my maternal grandmother lived with us for over 20 years, and that was extraordinary. But they wasn't a storytelling family. I will say that I did realize at some point that all of my best friends, including the man I married, are of Irish descent. So I think that I had a dividing rod for wanting this story piece in my life.
What drew you to it?
I do remember as a kid, I played with dolls late into my life. And by the time I stopped playing with dolls, there were entire cities that were created underneath the ping pong table in the basement. And these dolls were having affairs and getting divorces. And some of them were having abortions. And I was totally creating stories in my head and playing out these stories. I do not know where this comes from.
And stories, I would assume, against what I'm assuming is Irish Catholic faith of coming up?
No, I grew up as a very observant Reformed Jew.
Okay. When you said Irish, I just went to Irish Catholic. So I was like,
Oh,
divorces and abortions in an Irish Catholic household. What the hell is going on there?
My roommate that I lived with for many, many years after college, my best friend who introduced me to my husband.
You've worked with leaders and institutions for over 3 decades. What have you learned about the stories that organizations tell about who they are and how those stories shape culture, behavior, and decision making? And I imagine that leads us into your trademark narrative gardens.
The leaders need to see the entire landscape, and that we can be seduced into seeing one small piece of it. We can be lazy and see one small piece of it. We can be surrounded by people that are only showing us one small piece. One of the perversities of getting good at what you do and getting higher and higher in your work is people tend to only tell you what they think you want to hear. And so a large part of my work with senior leaders is helping them hear around the corners, helping them not be surprised. And story is a great way to elicit that information that you might not otherwise be hearing. It's a lot better in bringing out details and underlying the things that don't get said, the networks that are surprising that might not fit on the org chart, the way that information gets spread in an organization. A lot of that comes up through story. And so a large part of my coaching work is helping smart leaders get comfortable asking for stories and how they might be able to do that.
Yeah. Organizations often move quickly to strategy, but strategy is enacted through the stories that people already believe about the institution, which I love because you're saying listening to the stories, what you hear and what you don't hear. Believe about the institution, leadership, and what change will cost them. What does a company need to understand about its existing narrative before a new strategy can work, or their current strategy?
Well, they first have to understand what that existing narrative is, right? The narrative that they might think is the existing narrative might not be the narrative that the street's telling, that the people are telling, that their customers are telling. So understanding the porousness, understanding that people enter stories from different places is always really interesting and important to point out as well, that there's not just one door in. There's lots of different ways that people find their way into what might be the same story, but they're entering at different points or different places or through different people. Also, that they're going to tell a strategy. So much of storytelling is just that, is telling. I'm going to tell you a story and you are going to hear it and you are going to repeat it or you're going to understand it or you're going to accept it. And at Thaler Pekar and Partners, we talk about story sharing because the reality is not just the goal, but the reality is if I tell you a story, you're going to hear your own story. You're going to connect it to something that you already know, right? When I talk to you about the almost drowning experience, what came to mind for you?
A moment in my life where I almost died, but in a different way.
Sorry that happened to you. I'm glad that you're here
Same.
now. And someone else who might have been in Costa Rica would remember that, or someone who doesn't know how to swim would come at that story in a different way. But it's story sharing because you share a story to trigger a story in your listener's mind, to invite them into understanding. You cannot force a strategy understanding onto someone. And ideally, you're offering a story that somebody can see themselves in, walk around inside of, and want to be a part of. And that's the ultimate goal in sharing a successful strategy story, is making sure that it can be internalized and that it's sticky to the people, that it resonates with them at some point. I talk a lot about continuity stories and most stories are continuity stories or can be a continuity story, right? We don't like change. We say we don't like change, even though we change all the time, right? We get married, we get divorced, we move. There's changes happening constantly. But those stories about we've done this, and so we're going to do this, and it makes sense. We've done this, and because of that, we're going to do this. Now you're telling a continuity story, and you're taking me through it. And I'm not going to resist it. I'm going to be pulled along. And especially with the senior leaders I work with who are visionary and telling stories about a future and a vision, it's pulling people into seeing themselves there and how they can participate in that solution that's going to be offered in the future.
So you're really saying to senior leadership, let's tell a great story that brings everyone about the strategy, that brings everyone along so that they can identify.
And it might be several stories.
Yeah. Continuity.
And there might be different protagonists, right? Your narrative. So I use the term narrative to talk about the big story. And then there are the smaller stories underneath that support that bigger narrative. And the story, let's say you are the dean of a giant university. The strategy story that you're going to share with your tenured professors might be different than the strategy story you're going to share with the parents of your incoming freshmen, which might be different than the story that's being shared with your alumni that you're fundraising with. There's different stories that will all support the one big narrative, but understanding that different people are going to hear and resonate in different ways. So trying to give them the most resonant small story that attaches to the big narrative.
And in that case, is the big narrative the mission statement? Is it a shared value, a shared goal? Is it the vision of the dean? Who sets the narrative?
It can be all different things depending on the context that we're talking about.
Have you seen an organization attempt to change its strategy without first recognizing or revising the underlying story holding its culture in place? And if so, what happened?
I thought about an organization that I worked with that I came in. My firm also has a trademarked communication process called Heart, Head, and Hand. And it's a framework for motivational and persuasive communication or invitational communication. And I was teaching everybody in this financial firm this process and training them on it, and it became the way in which they were all communicating with each other and could hold each other accountable to communication as well. And I kept hearing a story about how afraid people were to present to the partners because somebody would get fired. There's the story about the person who got fired because they said one thing wrong. I heard it over and over again, and everyone used this as the fear for why they wouldn't speak up, because they had to be perfect when they spoke. And the truth was that firing never happened, Paige.
It was just a wives' tale? It just kept getting told over and over? It wasn't real?
Yeah.
How did the company correct that?
Yes. So I went to the senior leadership, and we then developed a plan through my comms training work and through the communication of senior leadership to address that issue. That's a story you want to tamp down on, a story that you want to pull out, a story you want to weed out because it was untrue and totally didn't exist. That's in contrast to another organization that had a story about innovation. And it was, oh yeah, the president says that we want to innovate, but every idea that we bring to him, he squashes. And so we claim we're an innovative company, but we're really not. That was a story from a previous CEO, not from the current one. So that too was a story that needed to be addressed and corrected. The other thing that you have me thinking of is I had the unbelievable honor of gathering 178 oral histories for Chuck Feeney's Atlantic Philanthropies. Chuck Feeney founded the duty-free shops, and he gave away $9 billion during his lifetime. And the central giving mechanism was a foundation that no longer exists called the Atlantic Philanthropies that was sunsetting. And over 5.5 years, I traveled to 6 different countries on 4 different continents and gathered these stories. And all of these are archived at Cornell, and they are there for other sunsetting foundations to learn about how to sunset. There's also tremendous stories about all the work that he did in all the different countries and the incredible big bets that Atlantic made. And so here was an organization that, when I started gathering these stories, was very different than when I ended gathering those stories, because in many of the countries where it worked, there wasn't a philanthropic field, a sector. So people were going to lose their jobs, and they were not going to find another job doing what they had been doing and doing very well and at a really high level of risk and frankly, very well reimbursed for as well. So there was unbelievable fear and the unknown when we first started out. And then that changed over those 5.5 years. And the simple fact of gathering those stories and sharing those stories with the staff, because as we collected them, we made compilations of them that were shown to the staff. And so they were seeing and doing the collective sense making to understand what this meant to the entire organization and what it meant to them individually. And it was a beautiful journey and long story to be a part of and to populate with 178 smaller stories.
How did you change as a result of listening to those stories?
I really like talking to people. I really like hearing people's stories. I feel deeply honored. I have been doing it. I've been on the road for 2 weeks gathering stories in Ireland and Northern Ireland. And then I went to England and saw a very, very good friend. And I said, I'm dreaming in Irish. Like I've got a brogue in my head. She said, you're out of your mind that you're listening to so many stories in such an intense period of time. How did I change? I've gotten very good at gathering oral histories. Love and deeply respect the ability to sit back and say to someone, this is your seat. You're the king. I'm here to listen. And on behalf of your organization who's hired me to speak with you, you're being given all of the space and time to think and reflect and make sense in the moment because you're respected and what you think about matters. And when you give people that kind of opportunity and respect, they are forever changed. Their commitment to the organization is much deeper. The story that they're going to tell about their relationship to the organization, that their impact on the organization's impact on them is incredibly. In addition to Atlantic Philanthropies, I've done large oral history projects for many other organizations. And that ability to celebrate and capture voice and the humaneness of an organization and let people think alongside each other is extraordinary. It's invaluable.
What advice would you give me in order to be a better listener? What does it take to listen to narrative?
I'm feeling very well heard, Paige. Please know that. Oftentimes, people have never been asked, what's the story or what do you think about that? You've been surprising me, and I do this for a living, and I've had to think extra hard about what you're asking me. So understanding that people may be saying something for the very first time, they're putting sentences together that they've never put together before. So letting them react to what they're saying is more important even than you're reacting to it.
How do you think it changes a person to be heard in that way?
This is the question I would like to ask everyone all the time. I did some listening research and was shocked, even though the point of the research, this was in some ways the thesis, but I was shocked at the degree to which people themselves are not heard. And until they feel fully listened to, they cannot listen to somebody else.
Repeat that, please.
Until you feel fully heard yourself, you're incapable of hearing somebody else completely. And the small amounts of time that people report being heard. Some people are in absolutely wonderful marriages or relationships and had, if I say how much great listening time do you get each week, they had, they would say an hour, 2 hours, or every night my partner listens to me. Other people would say, you mean besides my therapist? None. And far too many people would say 10 minutes. Really did not feel heard as individuals. So I would really like to ask everybody, what does it feel like to be fully heard? And so I'm going to ask you, what does it feel like to you? You're doing this project where you're putting the microphone on other people and listening to them, but what does it feel like to you, Paige, when you're fully?
I'm amazed when people ask me a question about myself because I'm a really good listener. And I find that it's true that many people aren't heard. And so often I'm in the listening seat. And I love the listening seat. I'm a documentary filmmaker.
Are you the person who always leaves the party and is like, oh my God, I heard the craziest things tonight. So-and-so told me this and so-and-so told me that this and this and this. And people are like,
I'm the person who says, I'm sorry, I can't come to your party because I'm such an introvert. But when I get asked a question, I just feel seen. And that recognition makes me feel more whole. What does it feel like when someone sees you and asks you a question about your life?
yeah, it's feeling seen. Who talks about conversations having doorknobs on them. And there are some people who do not converse with doorknobs. They're just talking at you. And there are other people who it's all about doorknobs and how do you open it. And I think what I'm hearing you say is you're very much like me. I will be in conversation with somebody and I'm such a good listener. They never ask me anything about myself because they're so happy to be heard. And sometimes they just are blowhards and they're just talking and talking and talking. But oftentimes people, cherish somebody actually being curious.
So the doorknob represents curiosity.
And generosity and graciousness.
So when we're thinking about building the field and the understanding of narrative intelligence, I'm struck by how much it is both about sharing, but also about listening. And so if we think about the narrative quotient and increasing narrative intelligence as if we were going to increase our emotional intelligence, we might think about our ability to listen and deepen our listening skills in order to increase narrative intelligence. That would be a requirement.
Listening to stories is a requirement. We're told to listen for stories. And that's incredibly important because, again, you're allowing people to make sense of things. You're hearing more details when you ask for a story. You can uncover paradox, which everybody has paradox. And to get back to an earlier question, when you asked about what makes you a good listener, it's inviting paradox and inviting people to be their complex, messy, nuanced, paradoxical selves. But learning how to ask for stories, I think, is an incredible skill set to narrative leadership.
And then the properties of that leadership contain curiosity, generosity, gratitude. Well, you said graciousness.
I think there's courage in there too.
Courage.
Because I always say, I know that I'm doing an oral history project or any listening project, because I'll do deep listening projects with organizations sometimes to develop a narrative framework for them, to develop a mission statement. I did a wonderful project with a group last year that the smartest people, hardest project I ever did because they were the smartest people I'd worked with. And I kept thinking, there's something hidden because all the surface answers they would have had, and they're not sufficing to them. So we dug deeper and deeper and deeper and listened harder and harder. But there's a courage when what I'm hearing doesn't make sense, when things are contradicting, then I know I'm doing it right. If I'm hearing the same thing over and over and over again, I'm not getting to the truth of what's really happening. I'm not letting people really be heard. It's only when it's messy and contradictory and when a leader has the courage to hear things that they never heard before and that might go against the status quo, that I think they've really developed their narrative intelligence. And the clients who choose to work with me are willing to step into that courage, that courageous place.
That courage and confidence be a part of narrative intelligence?
Yes, absolutely.
I want to go back to something you said that I think was really important. You said they're really smart, which means they don't have high narrative intelligence because everyone's telling the same story in order to keep the status quo. So they're smart in keeping the status quo, but that does not mean that they're deep into the narrative.
The group that I was talking about is a wonderful organization in New York called Greater New York, and they create these outstanding partnerships between nonprofit leaders and private sector and government sector leaders. And they're not super smart because everyone's telling the same story and they're hearing the status quo. They're super smart because they're super smart people doing brilliant work outside of the box. No one else is doing what they're doing. They might take 2 years to create the right match between these leaders who then are transformed in their leadership by working with each other, by partnering with each other. And what made the job so hard is that they asked us to come in and help develop a narrative framework. And all the easy answers they would have had already. So that's what I mean when I say that they were just really smart people. And I led my team in thinking deeply and listening deeply and doing intense sense making to realize there was something under the surface, because they knew everything that was on the surface, and we needed to come up with something more surprising for them.
So would you say that you can have incredibly smart people doing incredibly valuable work, and they can still have room to develop their narrative intelligence?
But yeah, your earlier question, right? Stories change all the time. Our understanding of stories change all the time. In an organizational setting, there are new people coming in. There are new projects. There are new products. The look at the world we're operating in now in terms of the economics and the tariffs and the entire systems in which we're operating are changing all of the time. So the sense making is ongoing and the wisdom is cumulative. And the more people you talk to, the more insight you have and the more understanding of different entry points you have.
In your experience, why is it so important for incredibly smart organizations to get better at sense making, which we might call narrative intelligence?
Really believe that people deserve to be heard and understood and to hear and understand others. And I believe that story is a tool for being heard and understanding. And so I lean into applying narrative in lots of different ways so that people can understand themselves, can listen to other people, can think about, can solve problems, can think about potentiality and possibility.
So I really am valuing this time together. Thank you. I'm taking in a lot. Like, just so you know, it's through you sharing with me, it's doing exactly what it's intended to do, is that it's making more meaning for me. We're putting words and meaning onto what I feel that I know to be true, which is what you said, that it is so important for people to be heard and to tell their stories. And then I went to why? Well, perhaps it's because that's where we transform.
Yes.
So when I tell my story, you ask me a question, I tell you a little bit, I feel seen. That makes me feel better. That connects me versus disconnection and loneliness.
Yes. I'll go back to the very beginning. I started my own business, my own firm 21 years ago, and I've continued to work worldwide and have done more story work by doing the oral history work. And I've come full circle, and I just started something called the Mile Square Conversation. Hoboken is called the Mile Square City. And I brought people together in June to share stories, to listen to each other and share stories about their experiences in the city. I didn't call it story sharing because I didn't want people to think it was a moth-like performative story event. I just said, there are no opinions. We're talking about experiences here. It was extraordinary to see the transformation in the room. The next morning, somebody wrote me and said, "Oh my God, I just said hello to a neighbor that I've never said hello to. Good job, Thaler." And I just believe in the changing, crazy world we're in, knowing your neighbors and being connected in that way matters so much. And understanding that people are so unlike you. And that's so fantastic. I always say, we don't go places. I would always get mad when people would travel and they'd come home and they'd say, "Oh, the people were so nice. The people were so nice." Like there aren't nice people everywhere. And we don't go places to do exactly what we're doing at home. We go on vacation and we travel to shake it up, to see things differently. And So we talk about commonality as being a goal. And this goes back to sort of the turn of the century that I was talking about, and what I think was a mistake in communication, to find the common values, to find the commonality. And I think that's different than finding a resonant story, and how you can attach to each other's understanding, because we might connect on commonality, but we really crave difference. And opening up the space for that is really important. Paige, you had asked me about the ethics that we need to consider in doing story work and asking people for their stories. It's incredibly important that we understand you can't take ownership over somebody's story. In oral history, we even talk about rolling consent and letting people come back years later and say, the way I'm seeing this story, or the way I'm seeing myself, I want to rescind the consent that I gave for this story to be shared. And people talk about rolling consent being the most ethical form of consent. But I was thinking of a story. I was in South Africa, and I was in a township I was interviewing a refugee who had come from another African nation to South Africa, who was gay, and had married his partner in this other country through a small ceremony. People found out, and he had to flee in the middle of the night because he and his family were at risk. And I was scheduled to interview him, and I got to his shack in the morning with my crew, and he said, "Oh, I can't be on camera telling this story. This is way too dangerous is this going to be shown anywhere?" I was like, "Well, yes, this is a film that's being made that will be shown on the web." And I realized he really wanted to be heard. He needed to tell the story, and that's why he had said yes to the initial outreach. And so, working with my wonderful cinematographer, we filmed his hands while he told the story. And at the end, he was crying and hugged me and was so happy that he could be heard. But we had to create a safe way for that to happen for him. So balancing his safety with his desire to tell the story, and also the importance of the story for people to understand the bigger narrative of the organization that was working on gay refugee rights in South Africa.
What did it do to you to see him be able to tell that story and cry and get it out and be a part of that, be a catalyst of change for his storytelling moment?
Honored that my clients trust me to hold those stories and to treat them correctly, and to walk away and not hear it if that was the right call to have been made at the time. And really proud of my clients who understand the importance of story, letting people be heard and sharing those stories with the world, and not just the perfectly crafted stories, but the real messy human stuff that makes people as beautiful as they are.
When you hear the phrase narrative intelligence, what does it mean to you? How would you define it?
I think of it as the ability to hear, to listen for stories, to ask for stories, to understand that we're operating within the context of stories, that people and organizations are operating within that, to recognize that story is both an input and an output. I think that that's the difference of narrative intelligence to just being a storytelling organization or a storyteller. When you have narrative intelligence, you recognize story as input and output, as process and product.
If you were to think of the people in your life who you know and think about how you just define narrative intelligence, Who do you know who has a high narrative intelligence, and what traits do they have that makes you say that about them?
I can say that one of my clients with whom I've been working for 4.5 years, I have seen his narrative intelligence develop, and it's extraordinary. And his ability at a senior level of leadership to see the context, to see the narrative landscape now is extraordinary. And he didn't have that when we started. He had the courage and the curiosity and the smarts to lean into it, and he wanted to develop it, and he has realized the benefit of leaning in to narrative intelligence, and that's an absolute joy. The other person, I would say, my husband Tom, has incredible narrative intelligence, practical, completely devoid of hypocrisy, because he knows the story he's living in and understands that other people have their own stories, and he's not so eager to define everybody to fit into a story that he's telling.
So true. I identify that a high narrative intelligence generally means a person who does not judge others very much or very often, because they can step into the shoes of that person or understand that they carry their own story.
And that story is changeable.
Yes, that's important.
You've got me thinking about things I had not thought about, doing my own sense making. I want to thank you too for the narrative assessment tool. I think I've taken it 3 times and learned something every single time. Here for you. Pleasure to see what you're doing and to see where it continues to go.
What did you learn from the narrative assessment tool? This is at storykeys.co. I've developed this assessment, just so our audience knows, where you can go take a pretty deep assessment. It takes about 40 minutes to do all 3 parts and learn more about your story archetype, etc. So what did you take from it? What did you learn?
They were not questions I had asked myself. So slowing down to think about the answers to the questions and the nuances between some of the questions is really interesting. And the other thing you're helping me realize, Paige, is I think as our narrative intelligence develops, we realize that stories aren't linear, and they're not even necessarily circular. They might be spiral, they might be squiggly, but they can take on all different shapes. And that's a huge part of developing narrative intelligence. I remember once I was in an organization and they said, "Oh yeah, we celebrate mistakes here. We're a real learning organization. And when you make a mistake, you stand up and you say, 'I made a mistake,' and you get to wear a feather boa, and you wear that feather boa all day." And that's what we believe, that we make mistakes. And one young woman elbowed me and said, "CEOs never worn the boa."
Thaler, thank you so much for this enlightening conversation. It's been such a gift and such a joy to learn from you.
Fun to hang out with you today, Paige.
Anytime. Before we close, here's what I'm taking from this conversation about narrative intelligence. Thaler helped me see that narrative intelligence is not just the ability to tell a story. It is the capacity to recognize the narrative landscape we're already living inside. Ask for stories, listen for what is present and what's missing, and remain open to contradiction rather than forcing everything into one clean account. She also showed why this matters in organizations. Strategy cannot simply be announced and expected to work. Leaders need to understand the stories that employees, customers, and communities are already telling and have the courage to hear what challenges the official narrative. Her definition of narrative intelligence may be one of the most expansive yet, and that is that NI understands story as input and output, process and product. It invites us to remain curious, courageous, ethically responsible, and open to the messy, squiggly, unfinished nature of human meaning. And perhaps most importantly, story is relational. When people feel fully heard, they become more capable of hearing others. And now I want to invite you into the inquiry. What is your NQ? Take the Narrative Quotient assessment at storykeys.co and let us know. Subscribe to 100 Stories, the Narrative Intelligence Project, and follow the series on YouTube. If you enjoyed this episode, please share with a friend. Thaler, thank you so much, and thank you, audience, for listening.